We're all good. So what I wanted to do with this is I wanted to present an argument from suffering and evil to the conclusion that God doesn't exist. And the reason I wanted to do this is because I think it's really important, especially on this issue. There's kind of two sides, the emotional and intellectual side, and it's important sometimes to think about the intellectual side and to be challenged, so you can think about some of the issues George mentioned and some other things as well. So here we go. So this is called the evidential problem of evil. So is there an argument for atheism based on the existence of evil that may rationally justify someone in being an atheist? So that's what we want to know. And this argument here is based on the problem of evil and some varieties of atheism. This is a paper by William Rowe, who's a sort of atheist philosopher. So these are the characteristics of God we normally believe in, that he's omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, and he's perfectly good. So there's some particular instances of human and animal suffering that occurs daily in a great magnitude in our world. I'm sure you probably think of some of them. And such suffering seems a clear case of evil in the world. So perhaps there's some reason for such suffering. And this is the argument. So there exist instances of intense suffering which an omnipotent, omniscient being could have prevented without thereby losing some greater good or committing some evil equally bad or worse. So that last bit of jargon is just saying that if there was an evil, maybe it could be permitted if it was towards some greater good. Might be some worse evil that might happen if we didn't sort of prevent that evil, but don't worry too much about that if that's confusing. So premise 2, an omniscient, wholly good being would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering it could, unless it could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So the first premise is just saying that a being that's all-powerful and all-knowing could prevent suffering, and then an all-knowing being would prevent intense suffering if it could. So, and then the conclusion that this fellow makes is there probably isn't something like God, because otherwise he'd be all-powerful, knowing, and all good to prevent suffering. So this is an example of suffering. So suppose in some distant forest fire, lightning strikes a dead tree, resulting in a forest fire. In the fire, a fawn is trapped, horribly burned, and lies in terrible agony for several days before death relieves its suffering. So far as we can see, the fawn's intense suffering is pointless, for there does not appear to be any greater good, such that the prevention of the fawn's suffering would require either the loss of that good or the occurrence of an evil equally bad or worse. Nor does there seem to be any equally bad or worse evil so connected to the fawn's suffering that it would have had to occur had the fawn's suffering been prevented. So it seems pointless. So could an omnipotent, omniscient being have prevented the fawn's apparently pointless suffering? And so he thinks the answer is obvious. An all-powerful, all-knowing being could have easily prevented the fawn from being horribly burned, or given the burning, could have spared the fawn intense suffering by quickly ending its life, rather than allowing the fawn to lie in terrible agony for several days. Since the fawn's intense suffering was preventable, and so far as we can see pointless, it appears that there do exist instances of pointless or gratuitous suffering. So that supports premise 1 in this argument that there exist instances of intense suffering which could have prevented, but it seems pointless. And so even if we believe there might be some point to the fawn's suffering, we must then ask whether it is reasonable to believe that all of the instances of seemingly pointless and human and animal suffering that occur daily in our world seems pointless, even if we grant that the fawn's suffering could have a point. And surely the answer to this more general question must be no. In the light of our experience and knowledge of the variety and scale of human and animal suffering in our world, the idea that none of the suffering could have been prevented by an all-powerful being seems an extraordinary idea, quite beyond our belief. So the whole point of that was just to challenge you to show there is actually arguments that people make to try and say God doesn't exist from evil and suffering. And by thinking about that, you can kind of bring into relief the issues and challenge us. So there's two theist responses to this that are really good. Theist just means someone who believes in God. It's a bit confusing. But, so this argument here, this paper here, is really good. You can get it free online. And then there's another paper by William P. Alston. So I could actually run through, because for me, this is important for me, because when I was studying, this whole argument was quite challenging for me about 2 or 3 weeks before I read these papers and managed to overcome it. So these are the 2 papers I read that helped with that. And also, George gave quite a few reasons.
I should be promoted.
Yes. Why God might allow some suffering. But ultimately, I think one of the main points Stephen Wistrow makes in this paper here is that if there is a God who knows everything, how would we expect to know the reasons for suffering, or how could we make the judgment that a suffering is pointless? But the other reason this is important as well is because sometimes there's a disconnect between theology and philosophy. Because I remember I was studying theology a couple of years ago, and we were doing a paper on suffering and evil, and the theology professor actually said that suffering is probably objectively pointless. And then a couple of years later, I read that paper, and so that's a big problem if we believe suffering is objectively pointless, because it leads to that conclusion back there. So that's my little presentation, and hopefully that'll spark some questions that George can perhaps answer, and if there's any other ones, and I'll see if I can answer them.
Let's throw it open now for discussion. I'm sure you've got lots of questions. There's lots of topics I didn't cover. I didn't talk about animal suffering. That's a whole topic all on its own. It involves us with how we view Genesis and how we view the fall. And, it can be quite controversial depending on what your beliefs are about Genesis. But certainly it is an important topic about animal suffering. So are there any comments people would like to make, or
is it possible to see those 2 premises up there again? Because
yeah, sure.
Thank you.
So obviously I don't believe this is a convincing argument, but it is quite powerful.
Yeah, I think the reason why it's a powerful argument is because it can become very emotive, and I think it's important for us to understand for people that sometimes when they're putting forward this argument, there are those who aren't even necessarily thinking of it from a logical perspective, but from the perspective that they have had a lot of suffering in their life, or they know people who have. Sometimes the appropriate response is to respond pastorally initially. I just want to raise that point as well. And you raised it earlier, George, as well.
Yeah. I think too often people who use suffering as an argument against God have often never suffered themselves. And often if you talk to people who suffer, often it has led to some spiritual awakening. My father, for example, at 82, got knocked down and lost a leg. He was unconscious for a month, and I thought he wouldn't recover, but he did. He came back to life. His memory was bad to start with. And he said to me, it's been a blessing, because it's restored me to my Christian faith. He was a Christian a long time ago when he was in Bible class days, they called it in those days. He used to do the Bible class syllabuses, and he was Dux in college. He was a smart young man. And he's kind of drifted in the last 20 or 30 years that I knew him. He was still a Christian. When you go to church and that, he encouraged me in my own faith. But that accident changed him. He started reading Daily Light, which was a little book of morning and evening readings. And I can remember at one stage the book was falling to pieces and he had sticking plaster and things holding it together. I said, "Look, Dad, can I get you a new one?" He said, No, this one. So suffering can actually lead to a transformation of life. And I think a lot of people, they either become very bitter or else they can see that there's some purpose in it. They can transform their lives. And I've found this myself, that I think as I've been through a lot, I've found that I've felt sustained. A lot of people, when I had this super bug, it's called Staph aureus, it's a nasty bug, kills about 50% of people. A lot of people were praying for me from the church and that sort of thing, and my wife just never believed I was going to die. She had a very strong faith, and I was in intensive care just for 2 days instead of a week. Injected and came out, and a couple of weeks I was home. I had a few after things, but yeah, I didn't sort of feel somehow or other I was on the way out. I felt that God still had something for me to do, and I felt at peace, which is interesting. So it's a difficult subject. It's not an easy subject, particularly if you're going through it. And at some stage or other, most of us suffer from something. I've sort of not really met anybody of a certain age or over that hasn't got to contend with some little thing, which is a nuisance. And it can either make us stronger or it can make us bitter. And I think that we have a choice.
Would you agree that suffering is necessary for us? That we learn more from suffering than we would from, say, God's blessings? That there's a purpose
There's a purpose
in
to that.
God.
Yeah, if we can see it. Sometimes we can't always see it.
That happens to us.
Yeah.
Because it's necessary for our own good.
Well, that's one of the reasons, I
Yeah.
think. Because Jesus actually said, he talked about an example where a building fell on people and killed them. And he said that they weren't any worse than any other people that had accidents occur. He went on to say that, well, may this be a warning to you, that you need to have repentance from God.
Yeah.
So it wasn't their fault that it happened, but it did happen, and Jesus didn't give a reason why it happened. But he did say this is a wake-up call, if you like. This is C.S. Lewis's megaphone to wake a deaf world. There's an element of that, I think there. And I think sometimes people who do suffer, and it's difficult, they do start to think about eternal things.
Start talking about
They start talking about the hereafter. When I go into the laundry and I go into the garden and I go into the kitchen, I wonder what I'm hereafter. Anyway, that's by the way. Just keep it light. Any other comments?
Could we have the two references that were
Yeah,
put up?
Yeah, by Webster and the other guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
So it's free on. They're both. It's a philosophy paper that I think it's quite readable.
Yeah.
And it's quite it's got some good theology as well. So that second one there is harder to get hold of though. But that one, the interesting thing about that one is it kind of does what George did towards the end of his talk. It gives different reasons why suffering might be might be required, and then it also then it says that all the pointless ones we don't know. How would we expect to be able to know, sort of thing. So yeah. So this is what you're doing right now is philosophy, so it's a philosophical presentation, so.
Yeah.
See, a lot of things that people say that's science, but it's not, it's philosophy.
Yeah.
And they say this is scientific evidence, but it's not, it's just a philosophical viewpoint. I think that's the problem, that people don't always distinguish. That's right, isn't it, Peter? They don't always distinguish. You mentioned that at the beginning of your talk. They
Yeah.
don't always distinguish between the two.
Yeah, and I think the other really interesting thing as well is that there's a lot of really good Christian philosophy going on at the moment. Actually, it's quite amazing. Like some of the smartest people are Christian right now in philosophy. Which so if you want to think about your faith, there's a lot of really amazing answers out there. A lot of really good thinkers. So don't be afraid to be challenged by different things.
I think also one other thing that might not have been raised yet is the whole point that if we're thinking about suffering in the broader picture and the hereafter, as you mentioned, for the person who goes to be with the Lord and in the new earth and new heaven, immeasurable, so wonderful and incredible that it puts any suffering that occurred here for us on earth into into a perspective that it either won't matter or it will bring out the goodness behind all that and the goodness that God worked out of it. So I think it's important in any conversation with a non-believer to point out that if they're critiquing our framework of belief around suffering and all of that, we are also aware that there is a far greater purpose beyond the life that we live now. There's an eternal.
I think it's a key one, isn't it? It's a key point. And if you don't believe in the afterlife, then
Yeah, and I think, well, the other point to make,
bad luck.
the other point to make is that that eternal life can make sense of suffering, whereas if this is all there is here and now, suffering has absolutely no meaning.
Thank you.
And the other comforting thing is Romans 8:28. And in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him. They're called according to His purpose. That's another comforting thought, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And then he goes on to say, neither height nor depth nor any other creature can separate us from the love of God. In the chapter. No, it is, yeah.